are tracking developments in the trial of 3 Tacoma police officers in the death of Manuel Ellis. Thanks for joining us. I'm Christine Pay. Ellis died while being restrained by police in March of 2020. Officers Matthew Collins, Christopher Burbank, and Timothy Rankin are all facing charges in his death. King 5 is live streaming the entire trial from opening to closing statements. We take you now to the courtroom live.
It seemed to me you guys went up from there, but I'm not sure where it got to. Because I think we're only at 20-something now. Anyway, we're ready for the jury. Any problem with you guys meeting, conferring, and doing that between now and Monday morning? Great. Great. Thanks. Okay, let's have the jury, Mrs. W. Mr. Burchard, have you concluded your examination? Okay. Welcome back, everybody. Please be seated. Okay, Mr. Purcher, resume when you're ready.
Thank you, Judge. Doc, I forgot to ask a couple of questions when we first started. I understand you went to Duke University.
I did.
You also went to the University of North Carolina.
I did a fellowship there.
Are you a Tar Heel or a Blue?
Neither.
Okay. Just checking. Just checking.
I coexist peacefully in both worlds.
Very good. Doctor, you indicated that in your report you ruled the death as a homicide, correct?
Yes.
And just want to make sure we're crystal clear on this. A homicide is an external force that results in a death.
An external force willfully applied by one human against another
That ultimately results in a
that
death.
results in a death.
You're not saying there's an intent to harm.
There's an intent to apply an external force that has the potential to harm.
Okay, but not a specific intent to harm.
It does not have to be a specific intent to harm, and definitely not a specific intent to kill, only a specific intent to apply an external force that results in death.
Thank you, that's all I have.
Mr. Usher.
Thank you, Doctor. How are you?
Hi.
Doctor, I don't want to belabor some of the points made by Ms. Eakes or Mr. Percher, but I want to follow up on a couple things, okay? Do you still have, I don't know what exhibit you have up there, but do you still have exhibit 2583? That would have been your
I do.
postmortem report that included both the diagram and the toxicology results.
I have it in front of me.
And we've had some troubles during the course of the trial keeping dates straight, so I want to make sure I understand. My report says that you completed it on May 19th, or at least that's when you signed it. Is that correct?
When I completed it and when I signed it are two different days.
Okay, good. So you completed it on May 11th, you signed it on May 19th,
Yes,
so I'm looking at the same document.
yes.
Okay.
During that time, it would have been processed and prepared for signature by the support staff.
Understood. So we're on the same page. Ms. Eakes asked you about one of the components of your findings in that there was no anatomy, I wrote down no anatomic cause of death. Is that correct?
Yes,
All right, and I think you explained that that's not unusual in some cases. Is that fair?
it's not unusual.
All right, and that same lack of anatomy of cause of death is oftentimes associated with what we call sudden death. Would you agree with that?
I'm not sure I can agree or disagree with that.
Okay. Well, would you agree that in sudden death, you described sudden death as I'm walking down the sidewalk and I just pass out and die, right?
Yes,
And in those cases, it's not unusual. Would you agree that there is not an anatomy of cause of death?
actually, I gave that example as something that could occur with a big heart. And in the case of somebody who's walking down the street and drops dead suddenly, the chances are pretty good they are going to have an anatomic cause of death, and it's either going to be a big heart or it's going to be coronary artery disease.
And if neither of those are present, there would be no anatomy of cause of death.
That's right. But somebody who dies of a drug overdose could just drop dead on the street. They're more likely to be sitting down somewhere, or,
Sure. And
but it could happen.
And in those situations, there's also a lack of anatomy of cause of death?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Percher asked you a little bit about the toxicology results with respect to Mr. Ellis. Can you turn to that portion of 2583 report? You see that? That's at NMS Labs.
I do.
And the quantity of methamphetamine when testing can either be in nanograms per milliliter or milligrams per liter. Is that right?
Yes.
Essentially, it's the same thing, just the decimals in a different spot.
Yep.
Okay. And so in this case, at least NMS Labs, there were 2,400 nanograms per milliliter in Mr. Ellison's blood. Is that right?
That's right.
And the metabolite, I think, that you described earlier, the amphetamine, is 54 nanograms per milliliter.
Yes.
And does that suggest to you that there's been a recent ingestion of the methamphetamine relative to the time of death?
Probably.
Okay. Because the range can differ amongst different humans, right?
Yes, it can.
Okay. Okay. You also, doctor, with the court's permission, I'm going to hand you what's been marked as Defense Exhibit 2650. Mayor Pro Judge,
650,
it's not been admitted and I don't intend to.
okay, proceed.
You recognize 2650, doctor?
I do.
What is 2650?
2650 is a copy of a draft of a PowerPoint presentation that I had made with the intention of finishing it to present it at the review of this, of the death of Manuel Ellis in the Pierce County Prosecutor's Office.
All right, and so as your role as the medical examiner, one of your duties when there's an in-custody death is to prepare a presentation for the authority that's going to make a charging decision. Is that right?
I didn't always prepare a presentation. I did for some of them. Some of them were straightforward and I didn't, but I was there most of the time, or possibly even all of the time.
Right, you would attend those, I'll call them staffings,
Yes, I did.
so you could answer questions from the prosecutor who's going to make a determination whether to file charges, right?
That's right.
And you did that in conjunction with the law enforcement agency that would have been responsible for investigating that death as well.
Yes,
And in this case, that would have been Sergeant Byron Brockway.
yes.
Okay. And then that's, you said, a draft of what you had prepared to present to the prosecuting attorneys in this case?
It's a draft because I stopped working on it when the meeting got canceled.
Okay. All right. But in the draft, you put in your thoughts about things that may be significant or that the attorneys making charging decisions might want to know to determine what the appropriate course of action in this case would have been, right?
Yes, that was my intent. I didn't ever finish it, though.
Sure.
These are initial ideas.
I want to ask you about some of your initial ideas and see if they're still your ideas, okay?
That's fine.
All right, so you have there's a slide in there. Because you just have, may I approach again, Judge, make sure you have some bait stamps on the bottom here. You have bait stamps on the bottom, Judge? You do, okay. Doctor, I just called you Judge. Can we go to 484? Do you see that, Doctor?
I do.
All right, and so in this slide, you're preparing to present information relative to the methamphetamine and what significance, if any, it may have on Mr. Ellis's case. Is that fair?
Not exactly how I would have worded it, but it's probably fair enough.
Okay, how would you word it?
It is a slide that shows a bit of general information about methamphetamine.
Okay, including the effects of methamphetamine,
Yes,
including the chronic effects and and the acute effects, right?
yes.
What's the difference between acute and chronic?
Chronic means over a period of time, and in this context, that would probably mean weeks to months at least, sometimes years,
Okay, and acute?
hours.
All right. So in the context, let's talk about acute, because that's really the time frame that we're focused on as it relates to when Mr. Ellis died. You indicate that the acute effects are mood changes ranging from euphoria to psychosis.
Yes.
What's psychosis?
It's when an individual loses the ability to test reality.
Altered mindset at that point.
Yes, not able to look at the world and figure out what is true and what is not true.
Okay. Are you aware that Mr. Ellis had previously indicated that when he takes methamphetamine, he experiences what he called methamphetamine-induced psychosis?
I'm not sure I saw a quote from him, but I did see a reference to that in his medical records.
At his Pierce County Alliance treatment records?
Yes.
Okay. And that would have been in November of 2019, right?
I don't remember when the statement was entered.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. The other acute effects are, you list are violent behavior, is that right?
Yes.
And the fourth bullet point is death, right?
Yes.
If you can turn on the NMS lab report as part of your 2583, there's also on there's a I don't know what the right word is, but there's a reference table to different substances and the effects of those substances after they tell you the quantity. Do you see that on there, Doctor?
On Bates 1675.
Yes. You see that?
Yes.
And so paragraph 3 talks about methamphetamine and the effects of methamphetamine. If you go on to 6, 1676, the next page. At the top, doesn't the laboratory indicate a peak blood concentration of methamphetamine of 20 nanograms per milliliter was reported at 2.5 hours after oral dosage of 12.5 milligrams, period. Blood levels of 200 to 600 nanograms per milliliter have been reported in methamphetamine abusers who exhibited violent and irrational behavior. Do you see that?
I do see that.
It goes on to state that high doses of methamphetamine can also elicit restlessness, confusion, hallucination, and circulatory collapse and convulsions. Do you see that?
I do.
Do you agree with that?
I do. I mean, let me just qualify that. I don't know where they got their information about the peak blood concentration. Presumably is from a paper. It probably is right.
Okay. And if we extrapolate the 200 to 600 nanograms per milliliter to Mr. Ellis's case results, you would agree that he has between 4 and 12 times that amount in his system at the time he died, right?
He does.
You spoke on direct examination when Ms. Eakes was asking you about whether methamphetamine was the primary cause of the death in this case. You had suggested that you would expect to see tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation if that was the case. Do you remember saying that?
I do.
But then you qualified that, didn't you? You said usually but not always, right?
I did, and the reason that I said that is because we don't observe all of these deaths. In fact, I believe this is the first one where I've had an EKG rhythm strip running at the same time somebody died.
But you can't say that there would always be those things if methamphetamine caused a death, can you?
You can't. And most of this information about methamphetamine comes from people who are in the emergency room or hospitalized. Most of it doesn't come from the few minutes or seconds immediately prior to dying of methamphetamine.
All right. I want to talk about the dilated heart, the cardiomyopathy that you talked about. That was also a contributing cause to the death of Mr. Ellis, right?
It was a potential cause.
Right. And that's caused by chronic meth use in some cases. Is that fair?
Oh, I think I could go farther than that. I would say that in this case, it is likely that Mr. Ellis had a methamphetamine-induced cardiomyopathy.
Okay. And when we have cardiomyopathy, one of the effects is it's unpredictable, right? There's a chance of dysrhythmia and it increases with the more weight of the heart. Would you agree with that?
It does.
Okay. In fact, in your PowerPoint presentation, 2650, at page number 0486, the same document that you used to prepare, or at least a draft to prepare for presentation to the prosecutor's office, that slide deals with dilated cardiomyopathy, correct?
Yes.
In the last bullet point that you indicate in preparation to present for charging decision, you wrote would be considered the cause of death absent other causes, right?
Yes.
You agree with that still, right?
I do.
And you said on direct examination with Ms. Eakes, again, you would expect some finding to corroborate that in most cases, but again, you qualified with usually but not always. Isn't that right?
I'm not remembering it that way.
Okay. Well, you'd agree
Yes.
that sometimes it's apparent and sometimes it's not.
Sometimes what is apparent?
That that's the cause of death. Yes, Judge. Sorry, I should have mentioned that.
The dilated heart doesn't change in its appearance grossly or microscopically if it's what caused the death. If you look at a heart from somebody who's, well, of course, you'd always be looking at a heart from somebody who's dead. You can't tell whether it's the cause of death even if it weighs 600 grams because that person could have been shot through the head. So there isn't anything about the heart that allows you to say this is definitively the cause of death. All you can say is this could have been the cause of death, and then you weigh it against other factors that could have been the cause of death.
And that's why you said absent other causes in the qualification of that statement.
Yes.
Right, so if we didn't have meth, or we didn't have restraint, or spit hood, you would have said that caused the death in this case, right?
I would have. If the heart is more than about 400 grams, I consider it to be capable, reasonably capable of causing death. If his heart had weighed 350 grams and he were found dead with no cause of death, I would not blame it on the heart. I would say the death is undetermined.
Okay. And when you're saying that, that's that 51% more likely than not?
Yes, I could not go past a reasonable probability with a heart that weighs 350 grams.
Okay, and his was how much, remind us?
480.
One of the other opinions in your post-mortem report I wrote down is, you said it's likely that progressive hypoxia was a result of physical restraint, positioning, and the placement of the mask over the mouth is a significant factor and possibly the most important factor. I'm not going to belabor that, but that was one of your findings, right?
It was.
All right. In this case, are you aware, you've reviewed, it sounds like materials from law enforcement and your investigator, that the spit hood in this case was applied by Officer Perenas?
I have tried very hard not to remember the names of officers in association with actions.
Understood.
That's not part of my job, and I don't want that knowledge when I'm making decisions.
Fair enough. Are you aware that Officer Collins had nothing to do with the spit mask?
I am not.
Okay. Or whether he was present at all when that was applied?
Well, I think he was present at the scene the whole time, so he probably was, but I have really tried not to put individuals' names in association with specific actions. That's not part of my job.
Right, because your job, doctor, is to be objective and report on the findings and let somebody else determine what, if anything, to do with them, right?
Well, my job is even more specific than that. My job is to determine the cause and manner of death, and while I can say this death is a homicide because there's a significant external force and because it was directed by one human against another, I don't have an opinion about which human directed that external force or exactly why.
Okay. Which is why in your PowerPoint presentation, doctor, you indicate very clearly that the classification of a homicide for the purposes of a death certificate is a neutral term and neither indicates nor implies criminal intent, which remains a determination within the province of the legal process. Those are your words, right?
What page are you on?
Oh boy. I knew you were going to ask me that question. It's Bait stamps 481 at the bottom.
That is exactly what I said.
I quoted you correctly, right?
Yes.
All right. Because your determination has nothing to do with criminal liability, it's only with certifying for purposes of statistics on a death certificate, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, and so sometime after you completed Mr. Ellis's report, I think you said that might have been the last autopsy you did. You completed some other duties. You retired, right?
Yes.
And then you became a consultant on this case. And I think this morning you said Mr. Hillman reached out to you multiple times to convince you to become a consultant. Is that right?
He did.
That's unusual, right?
I don't know.
Well, have you ever been asked to be a consultant on a case by the Attorney General's office before?
No.
As a consultant, did you recommend that that a separate forensic pathologist review this and opine about what you found?
I did.
Why did you do that?
Because I think peer review is a good thing. Peer review is asking somebody with similar qualifications to look at one's work just to make sure they agree with it. It's a standard practice in the medical world and probably in much of the scientific world, and I thought it was a good idea.
Fair enough. Mr. Hertzer asked you about Exhibit 2655, and I'm going to bring that back up to you because I think we took a... May I approach, Judge? you remember being asked about that this morning? I don't know if you're actually shown a copy of it. Have you seen that before, Doctor?
This is 2655?
2655, Judge.
Okay.
It's not been admitted, and I don't intend to admit it.
No. I didn't have a note that Mr. Percher had mentioned it, maybe he did, but I didn't write it down.
I think he read from it, but didn't give it to the witness.
Could be.
I probably have it,
Okay.
but I also have many, many thousands of other pages,
Like we do?
like you do.
Okay.
Only mine are electronic and not paper, but I'm still not positive that I have this, although I probably do.
Okay. You recognize that as an internal interview memorandum from the Attorney General's office from an interview you had with Mr. Hillman, Mr. Liu, and Drew Scott, who's a deputy prosecuting attorney here in Pierce County, right?
Yes.
Okay. One of the things that's documented in here, if you look at the interview summary, 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs down, I want to ask you if this is accurate and this is your opinion. It states, Dr. Clark stated there is no scientific way to come to a precise conclusion in matters such as this. Is that something you would have said?
Yes.
Explain what you mean by that.
Well, as I said earlier, there are 3 candidates to account for this death. One of them is a drug overdose, one of them is a heart issue, and the other one is asphyxiation. There aren't any papers that can help choose between those 3 things, nor will there ever be any papers that can help choose between those 3 things. And if that weren't enough, then when you get into thing number 3, the asphyxiation, there are also multiple components of that. And there aren't really any papers. There are papers that can suggest that a certain mechanism is reasonable or not, but even those don't agree. So you can't turn to a paper or to an experiment or any other standard way of answering a question to choose any one of the multiple possibilities in the group of things that could cause hypoxia.
And is that why on the next page, Doctor, if you go to the 3rd full paragraph, there's a statement that's attributed to you, and I want to make sure this is accurate. It says, Dr. Clark stated, I'll let you get there. The 3rd paragraph, the one that starts with when asked whether. Do you see
I have it.
Last sentence of that paragraph, it says, Dr. Clark stated that these questions could only be answered in terms of probability. This is the, quote, art versus the, quote, science of medicine. The best anyone can do is present the 3 factors and weigh them in general terms.
I did say that.
You still agree with that?
I do.
And the 3 factors we're talking about are still the meth, the dilated heart, the hypoxia or asphyxia, with the spit hood being one of those contributing factors on
Yes.
that side. Okay.
That's correct.
Understood. Just want to make sure I understood that. Then, Dr. Clark, you have Exhibit 551 up there with you?
It's probably in my pile somewhere.
If not, I'll find it for you.
I have it.
Oh. So 551, Doctor, is that the forensic pathology consultation report. I think it was referenced as something different this morning, but that's what it's labeled at the top. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And so this is something that you authored and sent to Mr. Hillman to clarify if there's any changes in your opinions from your postmortem examination after you received that additional information that you didn't have back when you authored the postmortem report. Is that right?
I think I probably sent it to Mr. Liu, but all the rest of it is right.
Well, it's addressed, that's probably true, but it's addressed to John Hillman, Division 2.
Yes, it is.
Okay. In this document, you confirm that meth intoxication cannot be completely excluded as the cause of death in the 2nd full paragraph of page 2. Is that right?
That's right.
And in the 3rd paragraph, you again indicate that dilated cardiomyopathy cannot be excluded as the cause of death. Is that right?
I don't see that.
Well, do you see the paragraph, it's the third full paragraph down that starts with dilated cardiomyopathy?
Yes.
The next sentence, the third sentence says, like acute methamphetamine intoxication, the possibility of this dilated
Yes.
heart causing death cannot be completely excluded, right?
Yes.
You go on to state that also, like methamphetamine, this heart rate is in the range capable of causing death independently and unpredictably, right?
Yes.
No, I would ask that the rest of the sentence be read there for completeness.
Any comment?
So, I didn't hear you guys.
She wants to know if you could read the next sentence too.
The remainder
Well,
of
if
the
you want me
sentence.
to, I imagine on redirect she could do that, but
Well, that's what she wants you to do now. Should we do that now? Are you objecting to that?
I don't care.
Then go ahead.
That's the part of the paragraph, right? It's a rather large paragraph, right?
Yes.
Just to be clear, I was only asking about the remainder of that sentence.
Well, let's see if council gets there.
I'll read that whole sentence.
Okay.
Yeah. Are you with it? You know what sentence we're on? It
I
starts-
know. I think I know what paragraph you're on.
Well, I read, also like methamphetamine, comma, this heart weight is in a range capable of causing death independently and unpredictably, right? And there's a comma there.
Yes.
You say, though it would be rare at this weight and at this age range. You see that?
Yes.
What do you mean rare at this age range?
An enlarged heart tends to be more of a problem as people age, possibly because they've had more years to use meth, but also because there's a lot of untreated hypertension. And the longer somebody has hypertension, the more likely their heart, up to a point, the more likely their heart is to become hypertrophic or heavy.
Okay. Turn to page 3 of your report. The third paragraph down in this report, you sent to Mr. Hillman, you provide the AG's office with at least a synopsis of medical literature that deals with restraint. Do you see that?
Yes.
One of them is an article by Stephen B. Karch, right?
Yes.
The other is by Gary Bilkey. Do you see that?
Yes.
And what you were telling the Attorney General's office when you sent this, or I'll just read the first paragraph, the first sentence, and see if you agree with what you wrote. Interpretation of the other interrelated factors, physical restraint and positioning, is somewhat more difficult. That was the first sentence, right?
Yes.
Then you cite these 2 studies, and you say positional restraint, even adding additional variables or combinations of variables such as handcuffs, hobbles, obesity, exercise, and added weight on the back did not cause significant respiratory nor cardiovascular compromise, right?
Yes.
That's what those studies say, don't they?
Yes.
In fact, with the court's permission, I'm going to hand you what's been marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 421. That's one of the articles that you cite to support your position in the memorandum you sent to Mr. Hillman. Is that right? That's the Karch.
Yes.
Turn to page, at the top it has page 39. Do you see that?
Is it number again?
I'm sorry, Judge. It is. What number is that?
421.
21, Judge. You see page 39 at the top? They have the little numbers at the top.
Yes.
Okay. And there's a paragraph 5 that starts ARD in maximum prone positioning with maximal restraint. You see that paragraph?
No, but I was reading the summary.
Make sure your copy's the same as mine. You see this title right here?
Okay.
Yeah. You with me?
Yep.
I want to go down to the second full sentence of that paragraph. This is the article that you cite to indicate that there's difficulty with restraint-related cases. This article says, because a respiratory component was suspected in these deaths, the same author performed an experimental study where volunteers were restrained, prone, handcuffed in MPRP, which means behind the back, legs cuffed, and hobbled to connect the two sets of cuffs, while wearing an early version of the portable pulse oximeter. You see that?
Yes.
What's a portable pulse oximeter?
I think all oximeters are portable now. It's a device that's about that big that clips over your finger to measure your oxygen content.
Right, to determine if you're receiving less oxygen in these positions that they're describing, right?
Yes.
Compared to controls, clinically insignificant decreases were observed in SaO2, what's that mean?
Oxygen saturation.
And pulse rate recovery time, both at rest and after exercise. That's part of the study, right?
Yes.
Of note is the fact that decreased oxygenation in the prone position was not reported. No study has ever shown that, except in ventilator-dependent patients suffering from ARDS, right?
Yes.
If you go to the first full paragraph on the next column, it reports on the different types of studies. Actually, the last paragraph on that same column at the bottom, because that will provide context. Simply put, there is no...
I'm going to object unless there's questions, Dr. Clark, as opposed to just reading from the study.
That's fine. You agree with what I just read, right? You cited it as authority in the memorandum you sent to Mr. Hillman.
I did cite it as a study. I did send it to Mr. Hillman. It doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with everything in it. These papers are sometimes very specifically written for a certain patient population. And I made that point in the report that I made to Mr. Hillman, that the populations are not the same as the population that Mr. Ellis would belong to. And that would be an impossibility to achieve.
We're going to get there.
Okay.
This is just the context for that.
Okay.
The purpose for you citing that, right? There's a purpose for you doing that.
Yes.
Okay. On that last paragraph, at the bottom of the first column, they're going to add context to what these test groups were doing and the results, right?
Yes.
Right. So the report indicates, simply put, there is no evidence that, as the term positional asphyxia, as the term is used today, exists. Parens, though crush injury to the chest and diaphragmatic restraint surely is a real entity. And yet another study.
Your Honor, again, I'm going to object unless there's a question, Dr. Clark, about it, as opposed to reading from it.
I've got to read it first to ask the question, Judge.
Well, give me just a quick second here. Doctor, since you referenced this article in your I guess in your supplemental report that went to the Attorney General's office, I take it you regarded this article as in some ways authoritative?
Not necessarily. Most of the articles that I cited were review articles that referred to other papers. This one is not. I wasn't trying in that report to Mr. Hillman to espouse a particular point of view, so I wasn't looking for authoritative papers that agreed with me or that I thought would would support any particular point of view. I was looking for papers that represented diverse points of view.
Well, was this article in any way relied upon you in your opinions?
In a general way, probably yes. In a specific way, no.
You're able to tell us where it does apply and where it doesn't? To your opinion, that is?
Well, this article, in fact, the paragraph that we're in now is referring to a group of healthy male volunteers. And Mr. Ellis was not in that group. So I don't think it applies to Mr. Ellis. But this article does show that there is disagreement about whether restraint can cause hypoxia in the first place. And that's why it's valuable, because there are there are opposing points of view, and there is an equal number of articles that would say restraint does cause hypoxia. Now, one interesting thing that occurs to me when I read this is that I actually don't think being in a prone position alone can cause hypoxia, because when there were so many people in the hospitals and intensive care units with COVID, one of the most effective therapies was putting them prone in the bed, and their breathing was easier in that position. So being prone alone probably doesn't cause hypoxia, but what we don't know is being prone when your ankles are tied to your wrists, and when somebody's sitting on your back, and when you're high on meth, and when you have a spit hood over your face.
Well, I suppose we're rarely going to get a medical article that is going to be
Well,
four squares with all the facts of our case.
That is exactly my point.
But-
There isn't one.
Sure, but that's true of almost any person you encounter, right? Or at least lots of people you encounter. You nevertheless use medical experience, judgment, training to reach conclusions, I assume, pretty routinely.
You do. But in this case, I don't think you can, because there aren't any definitive articles that can address these issues.
Well, and I guess that's maybe the point the council's trying to make. So I'll allow him to proceed with the question, and you can disagree with it if you care to.
That's where I was going to get to, Judge.
Go right ahead.
You're ahead of me, as usual.
No, I don't know about that.
Where I was referring to, I'm not going to read it. You understand what this article says. They actually had individuals in the age groups of 22 to 43 years old get in restraints, use hobbles. Some of them apply no weight on their back. Some applied 50 pounds on their back, and some applied 100 pounds on their back, right?
Yes.
And there was no recognizable difference in oxygenation or blood flow in any of those individuals, right?
That's correct.
And so in the memo that you sent to Mr. Hillman, you made the point of saying Mr. Ellis is situated differently than these individuals who had no effect whatsoever, right?
I'm not sure I followed the question.
Probably a bad question. What you just articulated when the judge was asking you questions is you're not sure this applies to Mr. Ellis because of the other factors that were present in him, right?
Well, I'm quite sure it doesn't directly apply to Mr. Ellis, and I'm also quite sure there isn't a paper that does.
Okay. But the reason that you articulated to the AG's office that it was not applicable is because of the meth, right?
The meth and the heart disease.
We're going to get there. I'm going to go one at a time. Meth, right?
Meth, yes.
And the dilated cardiomyopathy, right?
Yes.
And the spit hood,
Yes.
and other factors that, as far as the exertion related to the struggle with law enforcement, right?
Yes. And many of those factors I would point out are less than fully described. Since we don't know how long some of them lasted, and since we don't know exactly what positions, we don't know exactly how tight the hobble was, we don't know a lot about specifics.
But what you do know is that the constellation of those things relative to Mr. Ellis made him exponentially more susceptible to hypoxia, right?
I'm not sure I would have used the term exponentially, but I would say that as I said in the beginning, methamphetamine and his heart disease are likely contributing conditions.
Okay.
So in that sense, I think I'm answering your question, yes, but with qualifications.
I agree. Thank you. All right. Before you retired, doctor, you made similar. You undertook similar duties with respect to other in custody deaths, right?
Yes.
You did an autopsy and prepared reports. Is that right?
Yes.
And before we get there, I want to go back to Exhibit 2650 and page 483 at the bottom. And this is dealing with positional restraint. You see that title at the top?
Yes.
Last bullet point, you indicate for presentation to the prosecuting attorney's office. Further, there is some value to the homicide classification toward reducing the public perception that a cover-up is being perpetrated by the death investigation agency, right?
Yes.
This was in 2020, right?
Yes.
When the political climate around in-custody deaths had changed, right?
The bullet points on this page are all from a position statement that was published by the National Association of Medical Examiners. And I don't know the publication date
Okay. But you included that in there, why?
because I thought it was relevant to the question at hand. It does not mean that I agree with these 3 bullet points necessarily. In fact, number 3, calling a case a homicide to reduce public perception, I think is offensive. I would have never done that, and I don't think anybody should. I don't think it should even be in the position paper, yet it is.
Okay. But you were presenting that to the prosecuting authority because that was the position of that paper?
Of the National Association of Medical Examiners.
Okay. You performed autopsy and in-custody deaths up until you retired in 2020, right?
Yes.
And in each in-custody death in Pierce County, you ruled them accidental, did you? Until Mr. Ellis's case, right?
Well, technically, Mr. Ellis is probably not in custody, and many of the ones that you were referring to are probably not in custody either. In custody means you've been arrested, and I think there's a difference between in custody, which might occur in a jail or in a police station, and deaths on the street that occur as the police are trying to arrest somebody. So I think the term is a little bit different for the 2 classes. If you're referring to people who encounter the police and end up dead, almost all of them are called homicides.
Okay. Well, you performed an autopsy on Randy Steele. Do you remember doing that?
I remember the name.
I'm going to hand you Defense Exhibit 2656 and ask if you recognize this post-mortem examination. That's your report, right, doctor?
It is.
It was a post-mortem examination that you conducted on March 4th of 2017, right?
Yes.
And the report was signed by you on 20 April 2017, so a month and a couple weeks later, right?
Yes.
And in this case, Mr. Steele created a disturbance in a convenience store and police responded, right?
Yes.
Mr. Steele was placed in a lateral neck restraint until he collapsed on the floor, right?
Yes.
He was then placed in handcuffs by police officers, right?
Yes.
And then he became unresponsive and died shortly thereafter, right?
Yes.
And Mr. Steele had a methamphetamine concentration of 2.0 milligrams per liter, or 2,000 nanograms per liter, right?
Yes.
And you ruled that an accidental death, right?
Yes.
And the cause of death was methamphetamine poisoning, right?
Yep.
He had less meth in his system than Mr. Ellis did, right?
He did.
In fact, you indicate it's also possible that he was in a state of excited delirium, right?
That is not necessarily true. I put a sentence in the report. It is also possible that he is in a state of, quote, excited delirium, end quote. And what I meant by that was literally excited and delirious. I did not mean excited delirium as it is used as a cause of death. The reason I put it in the report is that the law enforcement agency investigating this case had asked me repeatedly about whether it could be excited delirium, so I addressed it, and the answer is no. The concentration of methamphetamine is high. It doesn't require the invocation of additional mechanisms to explain the death, but I also don't think excited delirium is a cause of death.
Okay, I'm not suggesting it is, but you included that in your report, right?
I included a reference to it because part of the job of a pathologist, especially a forensic pathologist, is to answer questions that are posed to the pathologist. And in this case, the police, the law enforcement agents have extensive training in excited delirium, even though I don't think they should, but they do. And so they ask the questions, and I need to address the questions. And I talked to them about it also. I told them I don't think it's a cause of death. But
there's many reports in this case outlining the dialogue between you and the detectives about testing that you could do for excited delirium, right, for markers.
and I didn't do it because I don't think it's legitimate science.
Understood. So that's the context.
Yes, I was getting all sorts of requests from them
Okay.
to try to prove it was excited delirium.
And you said in the very next sentence, however, this concentration of methamphetamine is very high and does not require invocation of additional mechanisms to explain the death, right?
That's correct.
So a methamphetamine level less than Mr. Ellis's, where the individual was put in restraints and died shortly after, was accidental in 2017. It is a homicide in this case.
I'm going to object to that's argument.
Overrule. You may answer.
No. I've already said several times that methamphetamine is unpredictable. It isn't possible to compare levels between two individuals and say one of them should have been called methamphetamine because it was higher than another one that was called methamphetamine. It's not possible to do that. I gave examples to the jury of somebody who used methamphetamine every day, same amount, and then died of it. People die of wildly varying concentrations of methamphetamine, and it is not possible to say whether somebody is going to die at a certain concentration. Now, in this case, it was called methamphetamine because at that time I didn't have any other conflicting potential causes of death. That's really the bigger issue than whether or not the concentration is more or less than Mr. Ellis. Mr. Ellis had multiple contenders for the cause of death. This man, Randy Steele, had been placed in a lateral vascular restraint, but he recovered from that. So I don't think that was relevant. There was no injury that was from that, and I didn't have any other candidates. However, looking at a case like this does make me worry that there was something that I didn't know, such as there was on Mr. Ellis's case. Before this present case, I was more trusting of the information.
You may continue.
I was more trusting of the information I received, and to some extent that's unavoidable because I can't go out and do all the investigations myself. I can't talk to every witness. I can't question everybody who has anything to do with the case. But it may have left me open to getting bad information. And at that time, it would have never occurred to me that an investigating agency would try to get me to change a cause of death, as they did in this case, and it would never have occurred to me that a prosecuting agency would get me to change my opinion, as they did in this case.
Okay. Well,
And I may have missed something, and if I did, I regret that. I wish I could fix it, but I can't.
all right, understood. I'm going to hand you 2658, doctor. That's another postmortem examination that you conducted in 2018, is it not?
Yes.
Now one has, the deceased is Robert Haig. I know this case.
I will probably remember it when I look at it.
Well, you did
Oh, I do remember it.
this is in July of 2018.
Yes.
You signed it July 3rd, 2018, right?
Yes.
Mr. Haig was a 37-year-old male, right? Who died following a struggle with law enforcement.
Yes.
In this case, a taser application was used to subdue him that didn't result in his subdual, right?
Yes.
It had no apparent effect, right?
That's right.
So law enforcement attempted to physically subdue him, resulting in a ground struggle, right?
Yes.
Mr. Haig was placed in a lateral vascular neck restraint for approximately 10 seconds, right?
Yes.
Then handcuffed, right?
Yes.
After which he stopped breathing, right?
Yes.
He suffered 2 fractured ribs from the restraint process, is that right?
Yes.
Which you say contributed to his death, right?
Yes. I think they probably... 2 rib fractures should not be fatal in and of themselves.
But in the context of restraint can inhibit somebody's ability to breathe, right?
It can.
And then contribute to the death, right?
Yes.
Toxicology report showed a methamphetamine concentration of 1.2 milligrams per liter, right?
Yes.
1,200 nanograms per liter, half of the amount of methamphetamine in Mr. Ellis's system, right?
Yes, but I don't think it matters. I think the important question about methamphetamine is whether it's over approximately 1 milligram per liter. And if it is, it's a candidate for the cause of death. And it's equally a candidate as somebody who has 2.4 or 4.8 milligrams per liter.
Understood. Cause of death in this case was what, doctor?
Methamphetamine poisoning with a contributing condition of struggle with law enforcement.
Manner of death was what?
Accident.
Last question, doctor, on your PowerPoint presentation, page 491. There's a slide with respect to your findings, is that right? Base stamp at the bottom, 491.
Exhibit again.
Yes, sir, it's 2650.
Yes.
There's a category or a bullet point that says subjective findings or opinions, right?
Yes.
And you go on to state a group of forensic pathologists would probably have differing ideas about how to interpret the objective and historical findings to produce an opinion for the death certificate in this case, right?
Yes.
And you still believe that, right?
Yes, because each one of them would word it differently. I think in most or possibly even all cases, the death certificates would be similar or maybe even identical, but the wording, how they got there, would be different.
Well, you classified the previous two, the 2017 and 2018, as accidental deaths, right?
That was based on the information that I had at the time. On both of those cases, I'm now wondering if there was something that I didn't have that would have changed that.
You disagree then with the proposition that different forensic pathologists could find the manner of death accidental in this case?
Well, I expect you would find forensic pathologists who would differ with the manner even, although I think most of them given the circumstances in the present case, would call it a homicide. Maybe not all of them. I don't really know. I'm just leaving the possibility open and making it clear that it was I who evaluated the factors and came to a conclusion, and that there isn't any law, there isn't any paper, there isn't any solid reference that I can turn to make sure I'm right. And for that reason, I suggested peer review, and I also leave open the possibility that other forensic pathologists could come to a different opinion.
And that's based on the 51% that you're required to use to reach that conclusion, right?
That's correct.
That's all I have.
Mr. Conrad.
Okay, doctor. There's a lot of exhibits up there, though.
I'm drowning in exhibits.
I wanna make this as efficient as possible, so I might get organized here for a second.
Well, do you need should we take our break then? Or 5 minutes from it anyway.
Sure. That might be it. That might work.
Okay, we'll take our recess, ladies and gentlemen, for 15 minutes or so. Please do not discuss the case among yourselves with anyone else. Thank you.
And the inference was that this report and this finding was in response to Mr. Floyd's death.
You have a comment?
Actually, it's not. The PowerPoint presentation was done after, which is at the time that he's presenting for purpose of charging. Didn't mention Floyd, and there's many other cases that were in the media besides Floyd, so I disagree with Ms. Eads, as usual.
Well, there had been several other cases, the Ferguson case, for instance, that predates this by a long while. But as I understand the testimony of Dr. Clark, this was something that he took from a forensic pathologist's group. I don't know, it was a magazine or newsletter or whatever it was. So it was something that would have had to have been written before the Floyd case, right?
Presumably, I think he said he didn't know when it was written. It's also, I think he said, it's not clear exactly when he drafted it, in terms of when the statements went in. But I'm just concerned about the inference or suggestion that this was following the Floyd case, which Ferguson, yes, I understand that, but as the jury knows and
Well, there are other cases besides that. I don't want to go into all the details. But
understood, but this case, the Floyd case with the I can't breathe is the the most obvious similarity, so to speak. And I just don't want there to be an inference that this was done, and he signed it, or he authorized, or he determined this death was hypoxia because of that case.
well, you can certainly, I suppose you can ask him about it, but I don't know about talking about the Floyd case specifically. I think that's not necessarily correct. But the doctor himself said, look, this was a consideration that the publication of medical examiners put out, but it wasn't something that he agreed with. And indeed, I think he said specifically he thinks that that's not appropriate. Did I misquote you, Doctor?
On that slide with 3 points, I did say that.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can ask him again, I suppose, but let's stay away from the Floyd case. All right, we ready for the jury? Okay, let's do that.
And what if I have to go to the bathroom?
We've had that happen already. We did just move this out of the way.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Please be seated. Conrad, when you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Okay, so I get the pleasure of going third here. So I'm going to try and cover some new topics, but I want to talk first about your original autopsy report that you did. And I want to talk about the factors that you considered within that autopsy report at that time. So the factors that you knew at the time that you determined the cause of death, and correct me if I'm wrong, the first factor was that Mr. Ellis was handcuffed, and this is in no particular preference order, was that he was handcuffed and hobbled, right?
Yes.
Okay. That he was in a prone position as well.
Yes.
That it was the spit hood as well.
Yes.
The amount of methamphetamine in his system,
Yes.
and then the enlarged heart as well.
Yes.
So those 5 factors. And actually, I wanted to, with the court's permission, if I could use the paper here to write them down. Whoa. I get that right? Those factors.
I knew all of those things when I signed the report.
Correct. The original autopsy.
Yes.
report. Okay. And, Your Honor, can I publish this to the jury?
You, I guess the one thing is that you
Well,
asked me about the spit hood and you have it listed.
oh, sure. You're right. Sorry.
But if you want to show it to the jury, that's fine.
Shall I mark it?
Yeah, well, if he asks you to mark it, he can
Well,
mark
let
it.
me, actually, I'm not done yet, so let me keep working on this masterpiece here.
Tag ready.
So so those factors, those 5 factors that you had, I'm gonna say equal hypoxia, right? Those 5 factors equal hypoxia, equal death.
Let me see the list again.
From your original,
Well, the meth doesn't directly cause hypoxia, so that wouldn't, and the heart doesn't
I think
either.
he's meaning to refer to all 5 of
All
them
of them.
collectively.
collectively.
Well, collectively, numbers 1, 2, and 5 would fall into the category of hypoxia. Heart would fall in the category of heart, and meth would fall in the category of meth.
Okay. So you're saying that of those 5 factors, there's only 3 of them that contribute to hypoxia?
Well, contribute and cause are different things.
Okay.
My impression is that this context is you're looking at the cause of death.
So if I removed hypoxia and I just said death, then would you be more comfortable with that?
Yes.
Okay. So why don't we do it this way?
This is before your time, Mr. Conrad, but it seems to me years and years ago, and I don't know, maybe one juror or 2 might remember this too. One of the local television stations had a cartooning weatherman, and I'm just sort of flashing back to that right now, and I'm just thinking, what are we gonna see next?
I don't know. How about this? Better? This is version 2.
I'm not sure I get the point, but I think all of those factors either caused or contributed to the death.
Okay. And so those factors are the ones that you determined caused his death at the time that you wrote your original autopsy.
Well, your original question was what factors did I know? And the answer is that I knew all of those factors.
And those were sufficient to cause his death in your mind with the knowledge that you had at that point.
I didn't cause his death, and neither should I have to defend the fact that he was dead. I examined his death and determined that those factors were either causative or contributory.
Okay.
Is there any other factors you'd like to add to this, Doctor?
That you were aware of at the time of autopsy is my question.
Yeah, I was aware that he was in PEA, according to Mr. Wilson's note. I was aware that he had fixed and dilated pupils.
Yeah, but are you saying those are somehow independent of any of these? Wouldn't those things have been the product of this?
Yeah, they would, but
So you wouldn't
now I
cause-
think I'm being asked what I knew at the time of autopsy.
Well, what did you know that was, what did you identify as the factors that contributed to Mr. Ellis's death
External.
at the time?
External, I guess. Well, some of them are internal, I guess, as well.
Right, it's a mix. I knew all of those factors, and all of those factors were either causative or contributory.
Okay. Can we have this mark?
It's gonna be defense 2584.
Okay. So, handcuffed and hobbled, prone positioning, meth, his heart, and the spit hood were sufficient to cause his death at that point, right?
I find that question to be oversimplistic, and I'm not even sure how to answer it. I just, the answer that the discussion I've already given is somewhat more complex than trying to list and say these factors caused the death without any qualification.
Sure. I guess where I'm going with this is, at that time, you had no knowledge of any officer placing any amount of weight, or when he was placed in the recovery, when Ellis was placed in the recovery position, or otherwise, at the time that you determined cause and manner of death for your original autopsy report.
I knew that he was at least transiently placed in recovery position. I did not know about the officer on his back.
Okay. So regardless of whether an officer placed any amount of weight on Mr. Ellis's back, you would have determined that he would have died on the night in question.
Well, I would have determined that he died no matter what else is presented as a factor, because he did die. I'm not sure how to fully address your question.
Okay. Well, let me show you what's been marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 418. Because I know there's a lot of documents, and I'm sure you've had a lot of discussions, but we had this discussion. If you could turn to page 43, please. Line 25. And this is in your February 23rd, 2023 defense interview. Remember that?
Yes.
Okay. And during that interview, you answered questions to the best of your ability, right?
Yes,
And you answered them truthfully as well, correct?
I hope so.
Okay. And so the question was,
I'm gonna object if this is improper impeachment.
Sounds like it.
how so?
You're just reading from it.
Okay, well, if you want to review it and refresh your recollection about what the question was. Well, so let me ask you this. So today your testimony is that you believe that regardless of what any amount of weight was on Mr. Ellis's back, that he would have died, right? Is that your testimony today? Because if it is, then I don't need to use the defense area.
Again, I'm not sure I can answer that as a yes or no. I identified 3 factors, and based on circumstances that were provided mostly by EMS, I'm comfortable eliminating 2 of those factors, leaving hypoxia. And I've already said that I can't establish or assign a weight to any of the individual components, and I don't think it makes any difference. It's still hypoxia because there are multiple things that happened. I don't need to know how long they happened or exactly how they happened. I just need to know that there were events that caused hypoxia and to weigh hypoxia against the other 2 candidates for the cause of death.
Okay. I guess my line of questioning, though, is tailored towards figuring out that obviously on May 19th, 2020, you wrote an autopsy report, right?
Yes,
And in that autopsy report, you determined what had killed Mr. Ellis, right? Among multiple factors.
right. I determined the most likely cause of death.
Sure. The cause of death based on a probability, right?
Yes,
Okay. And among those factors were these factors that we listed, right? That you knew at the time. The handcuff hobble, the prone, the meth, the heart, and the spit hood. Those were the factors that you knew in terms of that stood out to you.
right. Those were documented instances, and I think I see what you're trying to ask now, and I think my answer is yes, I did come to the conclusion that hypoxia caused the death, knowing those factors at the time.
Okay. So, and at that time, you didn't know that there was an officer that had placed any amount of weight on his back, right?
I don't think I knew. I'm not sure I knew anything about it. I can't remember for sure, but it was not part of the report. It was not given to me by the police investigation, and I don't think I knew it.
Well, in fact, in your consultation report with the AGs, you say specifically that you didn't know that at
Yeah.
the time of autopsy. Isn't that what you said?
Yes,
Okay. So you didn't know that information at the time of autopsy.
I do not think I did.
So you determined that Mr. Ellis was going to die regardless, that his death occurred based on those factors, regardless of any amount of weight that an officer may have placed on Mr. Ellis during the incident. Death would have occurred.
Well, again, the question has a conditional and a future tense in it, and I'm not sure how to interpret that. Death did occur.
Sure.
And I established the most likely cause and manner of death based on the information I had at the time. And those are the things that are listed on your sheet.
Okay. And that did not include any amount of weight on his back at that time.
No.
Okay. And you reviewed some of the reports, obviously, in this case, in the interviews of officers.
The extent to which I did that is variable. I did scan all of the, well, not all of it. I scanned most of the information that the Attorney General's office sent me, primarily for the purpose of looking for things that I might not have known that would make me change my opinion or that I should have known. I did not read them with for the purpose of figuring out who did what.
Okay.
And it doesn't matter to me who did what.
So after you signed this autopsy, so after you left Pierce County Medical Examiner's office, you then were consulted by the Attorney General's office.
Yes.
Okay. And you've talked about your conversations with Mr. Hillman about not wanting to be hired on in this case, right?
I wanted to retire.
And in fact, one of the things that you said that you thought it would be more appropriate that the new Pierce County Medical Examiner take this case on.
Yes.
And you felt it might be inappropriate for you to be hired as an expert in this case.
I don't know that I said inappropriate. I might have.
Okay.
But I think in some ways it would have been cleaner if they had just depended on the new medical examiner. But I can also see why they would want the person who did the autopsy. I don't think there's a clear answer to the question of whether they should have asked me or whether I should have done it. I ended up deciding, and I talked to Mr. Hillman about this. I told him that the only way I can do it is with the clear understanding that I still have to be objective. I can't come over to your side, as it were. I have to still be objective because as a public official, I did this autopsy, and I have to remain as objective as I can. And I think I've done that.
So one of the reasons that you had apprehensions about undertaking an expert contract with the Attorney General's office was that you wanted to be able to freely discuss the case, right?
Yes, I did want to be able to freely discuss it.
But then you ended up signing a contract with the Attorney General's office. Remember that?
I did. Oh, I do remember that.
And you described it actually as you felt that the contract with them was essentially a gag order.
Did I write that?
You didn't write it, you said it. You want me to show you?
The contract is restrictive, and it prevents me from talking to the press in particular. It also prevents me from divulging any information that they've given me. But I did talk to John about that very issue, and I told him that I have to be able to freely discuss the work that I did as Pierce County Medical Examiner before the contract went into effect. And he agreed to that.
Would you remember referring to it as essentially a gag order?
I don't remember that, but it's possible I did that.
Okay. And then that essentially prevented you from discussing the case without the permission of the Attorney General's office. Is that right?
It prevented me from discussing the things that the Attorney General specifically gave me after the contract started. It did not prevent me from discussing the work I did as Pierce County Medical Examiner, although to some extent it's hard to separate those two.
And you started using an email address called washingtonag@clark.biz.
Yes. But I have like 1,500 email addresses. I create one for every purpose so that I can sort them, and so that if somebody sells one of them, I can just delete it and I don't get spam on it.
So, since they hired you as an expert, the Attorney General's office has directed your work in this case, is that right?
They have.
Okay. You only review materials they asked you to review.
They send me everything that they want me to review, yes.
And you only did tasks that they asked you to do.
Yes, but nobody else asked me to do any tasks.
Okay. And so, for more than two years now, the Attorney General's office has been paying you to provide consultation opinions in this case.
They have.
Okay. And do you remember previously stating that you don't believe a doctor's opinions are valid if they're getting paid for their opinions?
I hope that's out of context because almost every doctor gets paid for their opinion in some way or another. So that can't be a true statement.
I think you specifically referred to it as being hired as an expert for an opinion.
I would need to see the exact wording to comment on it.
Let me ask you, do you remember previously being in a deposition in July of 2019?
No.
Okay,
2019.
correct.
Okay.
And during that deposition, you said that, you talked about, my assumption is that Dr. Andrew was getting paid for his opinions, and I think that invalidates his opinions. Remember stating that?
I do remember stating that. That's a special circumstance.
Okay.
I believe that Dr. Andrew was paid specifically to issue a specific opinion.
So moving right along, let's move on to a more substantive conversation about PEA and cardiac arrest. So you drafted a supplemental or consultation report in this case. We've discussed that a bit. And the consultation report is Exhibit 551. Would it help you to refer to the consultation report or discussing it?
It probably would.
Okay. And so, I can take this back too. So the consultation report, it indicates all the materials that you've been provided, or the materials that you've been provided by the Attorney General's office, right?
Yes. It doesn't list all of them. It just says that they were provided.
Sure. And, I mean, you're relying upon those materials to formulate this consultation report as well, right?
I relied on those materials as well as other things that I already knew or had.
And you would agree with me that your understanding of the facts, right, the underlying facts in this case are important in order to formulate your opinions in the case as well, right?
Well, I can't answer no to that. I think the answer to that question would always properly be yes.
I hope so. And so the facts that you set forth in this consultation report, when you wrote this consultation report, you had never seen the life pack data at that point. Is that accurate?
Partially. When I wrote the original autopsy report, I had some of the life pack data, but I didn't know how much.
You had what was contained in the pre-hospital care report?
That's correct.
Okay. But you hadn't seen the full-fledged life pack data?
I still haven't.
Oh, really? So, I want to talk to you about the facts that you set forth in your consultation report and the accuracy of those facts. So one of the things that you stated in Section 3 analysis. And in there, you discussed that upon arrival of the emergency medical personnel at the scene, that Mr. Ellis was face down, still handcuffed and held. You see that?
Yes.
Okay. Is it still your understanding that Mr. Ellis was face down at the time that EMS arrived?
I think he was face down when they arrived, and he was flipped about the time they arrived so that they could look at him.
Okay. And then you go on to state that the initial electrocardiogram showed normal sinus rhythm. That's what you wrote in your
Yes.
report. Okay. And then you said that the combination of normal sinus rhythm and a lack of a corresponding pulse is most consistent with pulseless electrical activity, PEA, right?
Yes.
You would agree with me, well, and the fact that Mr. Ellis did not, in your opinion, did not have a pulse at the time that EMS arrived was critical to your analysis in this case, was it not?
The fact that EMS arrived while he still had some life activity, meaning electrical activity in his heart, makes this case unusual. That's something we don't have on most cases. I didn't have that on the two that Mr. Alserer showed me earlier. So that puts it in a different category. The fact that he was in PEA is one that I concluded, but it's also one that was presented by Mr. Wilson in his report. He actually wrote that he thought the guy was in PEA. He thought Ellis was in PEA. And he said that during the interviews that we did with him. I don't know how to respond to your word critical. The fact that I had a rhythm, and let me also add, I never saw the normal sinus rhythm. That was something that Mr. Wilson wrote also, and I just quoted that. At that time, I did not know whether I was seeing all of the output from the life pack, whether I was seeing the initial tracing. It is common for emergency medical personnel to try to get some sort of paddles on somebody immediately so that they can see if there's a shockable rhythm. It's called a first look. And what I didn't know was whether the life pack recorded the first look and whether it was available and whether I had seen it. So I may have depended on the fact that there was PEA, and I think there probably was, but more generally and more importantly, the life pack initial rhythm strip showed a rhythm that should have been capable of supporting life. He was having regular ventricular contractions. He should have had strong pulses. I don't think he did. So I have a combination in this case of a rhythm that should support life, but somebody who is essentially brain dead at the time. That means I need to look at the three factors and figure out which one of them is in the best position to cause that constellation of findings. And the three factors, again, are a drug overdose, methamphetamine, heart disease, or hypoxia. I really think it's unlikely, not impossible, but very unlikely that methamphetamine could have caused a dysrhythmia leading to death that could have resolved into atrial fibrillation / flutter, which was present on the first strip that I saw. I also think it's unlikely that an enlarged heart could have produced that rhythm without going through ventricular fibrillation, and you can't get from ventricular fibrillation back to the rhythm that we saw. That leaves me with hypoxia. And you and other attorneys have asked me many times, what are the factors? How do I know they were important? The real answer to that question is the hypoxia was sufficient to cause death. I can't say anything more than that. I can't say which of the individual components was the most important. All I can say is that as a group, they did cause the death because nothing else did.
So, I'm going to get back to kind of, I want to talk about this idea that Mr. Ellis did not have a pulse upon arrival, or your belief that he did not have a pulse upon arrival. That when you formulated your opinions in this case, you did not believe that Mr. Ellis had a pulse upon arrival. Is that accurate?
Well, the
It's really, doctor, it's really a yes or no question. Did you believe he had a pulse when EMS arrived, or did you not believe he had a pulse?
it's not a yes or no question because pulse doesn't necessarily mean one thing.
How about I say mechanical, palpable pulse upon arrival? You did not believe that EMS had a mechanical or palpable pulse upon arrival?
Whether upon arrival or not, I'm not sure, but I do know that Mr. Wilson wrote PEA shortly after arrival, and that implies either no pulse or no pulse that appears to be adequate to support life.
No, he wrote that it deteriorated into bradycardia and asystole/PEA. So he didn't indicate that it was PEA prior to asystole, prior to flatline. He's never indicated that, right? That's not what his report says.
You can't have asystole and PEA together. So I think what he meant was PEA. He said that he meant PEA when we were in the interview with him.
I'm going to get back to my question again, which is, my question is, that when you first were formulating your opinions in this case, it was your belief that Mr. Ellis did not have a palpable pulse upon arrival of the emergency medical staff.
I neither believed nor disbelieved that.
Well, doctor, the question isn't about what you think about it now. The question is when you wrote the report, did you have an opinion about it one way or the other?
Well, I thought he probably had a weak pulse, maybe a very weak pulse proceeding to no pulse, because Mr. Wilson did write PEA and he stated PEA. I don't know.
So if Mr. Conrad's point is that that his reading of that report is that he had a pulse and it developed a PEA. You didn't read it that way.
No, I think it's possible to read it that way, but that doesn't matter. If he had PEA at any point, then he has PEA.
Yeah, but you're trying to, I suffer from this too. I want to give you the answer, but that's not like 2 + 2 = 4. That's not how this is working. Question is, at that moment in time when you're writing this report, you had something in mind about what was the condition of Mr. Ellis when the medical folks arrived. And either you didn't think there was a pulse, or you did, or you saw that, or you understood there was a pulse but didn't believe it. I mean, it was really only those couple of 3 alternatives, and it seems to me you need to clearly answer that.
Well, of those, I will choose option 3. I don't think it's likely that there was sufficient heart activity to support life, even if there were thready pulses, I think is the way Mr. Wilson later described them.
So, Judge, I'm going to show this doctor exhibit 417 so we can think long. So 417, line 15.
Line 15, is it your opinion?
417.
Sorry.
And the question was, is it your opinion that when... Sorry, 43. Is it your...
43
Page 43, line 15 through 17. The question is it your opinion that when emergency medical staff arrived on scene that Mr. Ellis did not have a pulse? Answer, I don't think he did when they arrived. That's what you told us, right?
Yes.
During the defense interview.
And that's the same thing I just answered when the court asked me the question.
Okay. And in fact, that's what you wrote in your consultation report to the Attorney General's office as well.
Yes.
Okay. And you also wrote that he had normal sinus rhythm on the EKG, right?
Yes.
And so you relied upon the fact that he had normal sinus rhythm without a palpable pulse.
Yes.
Okay. And that formed your belief that he had a PEA, pulseless electrical activity, cardiac arrest.
It did, but it was not the only thing that I considered. He also had an...
That's fine, doctor, but that's not my question.
The witness should be allowed to answer the question.
He's not answering.
Well, he's elaborating on an explanation for the answer, but that isn't what's been asked for in the question. So you can get back to it on redirect if you care to. But we do need to confine the answers to the questions asked.
question is, you determined, based on the fact that he had normal, in your report, you stated that he showed normal sinus rhythm combined with a lack of corresponding pulse is most consistent with pulseless electrical activity, right?
Yes.
Okay. And that formed your opinion that he had a PEA cardiac arrest, correct?
Those factors went into my opinion, yes.
Okay. And now you come to understand that the testimony from Lieutenant Wilson, which you've reviewed, is that he had felt a pulse at the time that he arrived, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And he, in fact, his testimony, and you've reviewed it, so have I, he said that it was variable as well, right?
Yes.
He said it would be super high and super low. It was variable. And he said that to Washington State Patrol in his interview as well, that he had a pulse. Remember that?
No.
Okay. Have you reviewed his interview with Washington State Patrol?
Not in a long time.
Okay. And the fact that he had a pulse, well, let me ask you this. The EKG also doesn't show normal sinus rhythm either, as you state in your report. Do you agree with me on that?
Well, sort of.
Okay. I mean, the EKG shows atrial fibrillation or atrial flutter.
Yeah, but as I've already stated, I didn't know if that first rhythm strip that was included in this report was actually the first rhythm that they saw.
Okay. And I get, I mean, you're confined to the information that's been provided to you. It sounds like the life pack information was not provided to you as well, right?
Right, but I know what was in it now because I read the cardiologist's testimony.
Okay. So you'd agree with me that it's not normal sinus rhythm?
No, the cardiologist said that there was never any sinus rhythm on what he saw, and he saw all of the life pack output.
Okay.
And it's my understanding from the Attorney General's office that there wouldn't have been anything that the EMTs would have seen on the screen that wasn't recorded.
You know, remove the strike, it's not responsive, of course, to that.
Jury, disregard the last response to the witness.
And you noted that it was PEA because that PEA, a PEA cardiac arrest, is consistent with your finding of hypoxia, right?
Not in that order.
Okay.
You're suggesting that I found hypoxia and then looked for a justification for it, and that is not the case.
Okay. And in fact, I asked you during the interview, and you can follow along if you want on page 63, if you still have it up there. Page 63, lines 16 through 20. I asked you that the fact that when EMS emergency medical staff arrived, and it's your opinion that Mr. Ellis did not have an initial pulse, that is critical to your determination here. And your answer was yes.
And the question is that correct?
Did I read that right?
Yes.
You want to talk about chemosiderin-laden macrophages?
I'd be happy to.
Okay. So, chemosiderin-laden macrophages, if I understand it correctly. That's when the heart, when you have a dilated heart, right, it leads to some degree of heart failure.
Yes.
Okay. And that means that the heart is not pumping blood adequately, right?
Yes.
All right. And that when the heart would normally have cleared out blood from the capillaries in the lungs, it doesn't do so and the blood just kind of sits there. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And then the blood spills out, as it sits there, it spills out into the surrounding tissue within the lungs, right? Or the alveolar?
Alveolar, it's beginning to be a little bit too simplified because it isn't the fact that the blood is sitting there. Capillaries are thin, very thin walls so that air can be exchanged across them. And if the heart isn't pumping all that's asked of it, the pressure builds up, and it's pressure that's the important point. When pressure builds up in those capillaries, blood can leak across, red blood cells can leak across into the alveolar spaces where they get eaten by macrophages.
Took it from me. So it's a foreign material within that area, within the tissue, and the macrophages come and eat it up.
They do.
Okay. And this is a process that takes weeks or months, right?
Yes.
Okay. It's not something that would have happened that night.
No, it would not have happened that night.
And it's evidence of the fact that Mr. Ellis was in some degree of heart failure as well, right?
Yes, it is.
And you're aware of the fact that actually Dr. Mitchell, he had additional iron stains done. Are you not?
I saw that.
Okay. And that showed that it was positive for iron stains of hemosiderin macrophages, right?
Yes.
And so that's something that shows that Mr. Ellis was in some degree of heart failure at the time of this incident.
He was in heart failure chronically. That the presence of macrophages says nothing about his condition at the time. It isn't an acute finding, it's a chronic finding,
Okay.
which means over time.
Other thing I wanted to talk about was this idea of whether Mr. Ellis aspirated any blood or food that would have inhibited his ability to breathe. Now, the lungs showed some edema and focal intra-alveolar, right?
Alveolar.
Close. And I think Dr. Mitchell actually talked about that as well. But you believe that that a finding of edema in that, which you indicated in your autopsy report, that happens to most people that die, right?
It does.
Okay. So it has many causes that it's not possible to draw a conclusion from that notation within your autopsy report that there's something unusual going on, that there's some blood or food that's been aspirated, correct?
Well, you're throwing the food part into a question series that's been about blood and macrophages,
Okay.
but I think I can answer both. The two are different questions. Blood in the lungs comes from the capillaries, mostly. It can also be breathed in if, say, there's an injury in the mouth. You can breathe the blood in, but that would just be red blood cells in the lungs. It wouldn't be hemosiderin-laden macrophages because the macrophages haven't eaten it yet.
Right, which is what we found here. So
Right.
we know that that the blood in the lungs was not something that he breathed in that night. It was something that's a result of his heart failure.
That's correct.
Okay.
You also mentioned edema.
Yeah.
Edema is fluid that comes from the bloodstream that does not contain red blood cells. It contains protein, and it leaks across the capillary spaces just the same way that red blood cells do. It is also not an uncommon finding, and in fact, most people who have autopsies have some sort of pulmonary edema. It can occur just as a result of gravity, because if somebody dies in a position where gravity can make the blood flow towards the chest, then that can put enough pressure on the capillaries to break them, that alone, even after death. The question of food is yet a third component. The food that's chewed and swallowed normally passes over the airway back to the esophagus where it goes into the stomach. Under some conditions, particularly people who are intoxicated or otherwise impaired, they can breathe that food in down the trachea instead of the esophagus, and it can end up in the lungs.
There's nothing that you indicated in the autopsy report that there was any amount of food that get aspirated or anything like that would have inhibited his breathing, right?
Right, and when it happens during life and there's significant aspiration, there's what's called a response to it in the lungs. It's often possible to see large pieces of food blocking airways and they're surrounded by hemorrhage. If you don't see that, it's not real aspiration, because aspiration also occurs at the time of death. Many people, if not most people, vomit at the time they're dying, and when people vomit, that brings food up from the stomach that then lies in the throat, and if they have any sort of agonal respirations at all, then they can inhale that food. And the difference between those two is that in cases of agonal or aspiration that occurs at the time of death, it doesn't leave the vital response of hemorrhage in the lungs. Mr. Ellis did not have that sort of aspiration with vital response, including hemorrhage surrounding the aspirated food particles in his lungs. Therefore, I think he has the normal sort of vomit when you're dying and breathe in some of the food during final agonal breaths. And it's not uncommon. Many people have that finding. It's not significant.
Nothing that would have inhibited his breathing
No.
or contributed to the hypoxia.
No. If he had had a significant event of aspiration, the food would have blocked some of his airways, and he would have, in the process of trying to get a deep breath with the food blocking his airways, he would have pulled blood out of the capillaries around that food, and it would have been visible microscopically all over the lungs.
Okay. A couple more questions here, doctor. So the dilated heart that Mr. Ellis had, it's also common that a symptom of that would be that he would be wheezing or short of breath with exertion as well, right?
That is correct.
Okay. And if the other question I have is about the brain injury that you've talked about, and one of the things that you discussed with us during the interview was that you felt that there was that he had this brain injury was because he didn't have a pulse at that time, right?
He was brain dead because he had insufficient oxygen. He may have had a pulse at the time he became brain dead, probably did, but the blood wasn't carrying enough oxygen at the time to support his brain.
One of the factors that you relied upon was the presence or absence of a pulse, though, correct?
Yes, but he began the process of becoming brain dead several minutes before our first look.
Okay. And you've talked about the fixed and dilated pupils as well?
Yes.
Okay. But a brain injury or fixed and dilated pupils are as consistent with a cardiac event as they would be with a hypoxic injury as well, right?
Well, sure, anything that causes lack of blood flow to the brain or lack of oxygen in that blood can produce brain death, would produce brain death.
Okay.
And you can't look at the brain death and tell what caused it.
Okay. So a couple more questions here. So, you'd agree with me that this case is complex in terms of the medical and pathological issues.
I would agree with that
Okay.
wholeheartedly.
Whole are highly complex, but there could be differing opinions on cause and manner, right?
Yes.
Okay. And you would agree with me that forensic pathologist and the ME here in Pierce County for 10 years. You saw people with heart disease all the time, right? Decedents.
Yes.
Okay, that died as a result of heart disease.
Yes.
Probably the number one thing that you saw.
Not necessarily, but only because some of them made it to the hospital and got a diagnosis, and so didn't come to our attention. Some of them that might have otherwise. I don't know whether it would be that or drug overdoses.
Well, drug overdose was going to be the second one I was going to bring
Yeah.
up. So drug overdose, number 2.
Let's call it a tie.
Okay. Another thing that you saw all the time is the ME, unfortunately, here in Pierce County, right?
Yes.
Okay. And chronic hypertension as well, right? Another thing. You saw people all the time.
When I saw people, they didn't have chronic hypertension because they had no tension at all.
Correct. Okay. But they had died as a result of chronic hypertension.
Well, as a contributing condition.
Sure. And Mr. Ellis had a cardiomyopathy and heart disease, right?
He did.
He had a lethal amount of methamphetamine in his system,
Yes.
and he had chronic hypertension as well.
I don't know if he was diagnosed with hypertension per se, but he would have had hypertension by being a methamphetamine addict, because methamphetamine causes hypertension, and that's how it causes its heart damage. One of the main ways.
Let me check with my co-counsel, but I'm not sure. I don't have anything else. Thank you, Doc.
We've only got 3 minutes. I don't know if you want to get started now. If you do, that's fine with me.
Sure, happy to get started.
Okay.
Dr. Clark, you were asked some questions about your supplemental report, which is Exhibit 551. Do you still have that up there?
Yes.
And do you recall being asked questions about a statement in your report? If you look at page 2, you remember defense counsel reading you this and asking if you said it? It's in the second paragraph. Methamphetamine intoxication cannot be completely excluded as the cause of death. Do you recall Mr. Osser asking you that?
Yes.
And can you just read the rest of the sentence that you wrote there?
But the probability is low.
And why did you say that the probability is low that methamphetamine could be the cause of death?
Because methamphetamine, if it causes death, should do so by creating a fast heart rate, not a progressively slow heart rate that includes atrial fib and flutter. It's more likely that it would produce ventricular fibrillation.
And you were also asked some questions about the autopsy of Randy Steele. Do you still have Exhibit 2656?
I don't. Somebody took all of my collection of exhibits.
See if I can find it for you. And you knew Exhibit 2656 as well as 2658. With respect to Mr. Steele, Dr. Clark, did you have any evidence that Mr. Steele had said that he couldn't breathe prior to dying?
No.
Did you have any information that Mr. Steele was restrained in a prone position with weight of an officer on his back?
Object reading.
I'll permit this overruled. You may answer, Doctor.
No.
Okay. And could you take a look at Exhibit 2658 then, the autopsy of Mr. Steele? In that case, did you have any information that Mr. Haig had said that he couldn't breathe once he was restrained?
No.
And did you have any information that Mr. Haig was restrained in a prone position with weight on his back?
No.
You were asked questions about 2650, a PowerPoint, a draft PowerPoint, I believe, that you talked about. I'm going to hand that back to you. page that ends in 491.
I'm sorry, say the number again.
2650.
2650, thank you.
And do you recall being asked questions by Mr. Oster about the subjective findings portion of this draft PowerPoint?
Yes.
And do you recall that he read the first bullet point about a group of forensic pathologists who probably have differing ideas?
Yes.
Now, what does the next bullet point that you put in there say?
Likely that most would agree that restraint is a significant factor.
And do you still have that opinion?
Yes.
And why?
Because almost any forensic pathologist working through this matrix of information would come to the same conclusion that I did, that methamphetamine is unlikely because there was no ventricular fibrillation, that sudden death from his enlarged heart is unlikely because there was no ventricular fibrillation, and that leaves hypoxia, and that was caused by restraint.
Does it matter to your opinions whether Mr. Ellis had a pulse before or after fire's arrival?
I would have come to the same conclusion either way
And why is that?
because of the rhythm that was on the rhythm strip.
Explain that to us.
The rhythm that I saw and that I now know was the initial rhythm was atrial fibrillation, and there was a ventricular response, meaning that the ventricles were beating, not regularly, but they still were beating, and it should have been enough to support life.
You were asked some questions when you were testifying on cross-examination. You mentioned that a prosecutor's office had tried to get you to change your opinion in
Yes.
this case. Was that the Attorney General's office?
It was not. It was the Pierce County Prosecutor's Office.
Okay, just a moment. I don't have anything further. Thank you, Dr. Clark.
No, thank you, Doctor. I don't have any other questions.
A couple of follow-up. The rhythm strip that you've seen, it has rhythms of atrial fibrillation as well as atrial flutter, correct?
It goes back and forth, yes.
Okay. And the fact that it's atrial fibrillation or atrial flutter that you're seeing, that doesn't mean that he couldn't have had some ventricular tachycardia previous to that, right?
It does not exclude ventricular tachycardia because it is possible to recover from some forms of ventricular tachycardia, while it is not possible to recover from ventricular fibrillation.
Okay. So it's possible that Mr. Ellis, as a result of his dilated heart and methamphetamine concentrations, he had a ventricular tachycardia, an arrhythmia that's ventricular tachycardia prior to EMS arriving.
That is possible.
Okay.
Ms. Eakes?
I don't have anything. Thank you.
Ms. Pritchard? Strasser? Okay. Thank you very much. All right, Doctor, you're going to be excused. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll excuse you for today. Please come back on Monday. Please do not discuss case among yourselves with anyone else. Do not permit anyone to discuss case with you or in your presence, and please avoid any social media or other media coverage on the subject of this trial. Thank you.